all our listeners and participants. I'm welcoming you to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution Big Read, Prisoners of Geography. This morning, we're welcoming best-selling author, Tim Marshall, who wrote Prisoners of Geography. And I'll tell you a little bit about him, but he has agreed to be with us this morning. Tim is a leading authority on foreign affairs, and he has more than 25 years of reporting experience. He was, as many of you will know, the diplomatic editor at Sky News, and before that, he had worked for the BBC and for the LBC IRN radio. He has, of course, reported from more than 30 countries, including many of those in conflict, such as Croatia, Iraq, Syria, Israel, and so forth. His blog, Foreign Matters, was shortlisted in 2010 for the Orwell Prize. And he's also written for our leading newspapers, including the Sunday Times, the Times, the Daily Telegraph, the Guardian, and the Independent. He has another interest, which some of you will have read about, and that is in the story of Britain's football chants and further books, including Divided and Worth Dying For, The Power and Politics of Flags. He is the founder and editor of the What and the Why.com. And we're now going to turn to Tim. Tim, you're welcome.
Let's concoct a wild scenario in which Mr. Trump does not give up power, challenges it through the courts. We get to January the 20th and both of them show up to be inaugurated, by which time one of them's called out the National Guard. Each individual state has sent 2 lots of electoral college voters to the newly elected. Let's concoct that wild scenario, at which point the violence on the streets, which we've seen this year quadruples, and they plunge into some sort of civil war. Not north-south, but everybody against each other. In the aftermath, the United States will still be there, and it will rise, and there will still be the geography. There will still be the fact that it has 2 oceans, that it has benign neighbours to its north and south, that it has the greatest farmland in the world. All those factors are still there. So I don't think that these internal disputes that we're having in the liberal democracies, or indeed in the other countries which are not that, I don't think they affect the fact that the geography will still impact on the decisions that are made.
Your book, Prisoners of Geography, sold very well and is still selling very well in the United States. Do you feel that have you had feedback from the United States readers that is significantly different or shown more insight or less insight than those of us here in Europe?
No, not really. The 3 places it sold the best were Britain, Germany, and then the United States. Modesty means I can't tell you how many it's sold globally, but it's 1.5 million. The Americans, both in the criticisms of it and praise for it, have been pretty much on the same lines. Overwhelmingly what I get back is from people saying, this taught me to look at the world in a different way. That's exactly what I set out to do, is that people could suddenly start factoring in the fact that big mountain there, I need to know about it. I can't understand this situation unless I know about that mountain. I would they are the best educated country in the world. We have a rather snobbish attitude towards them, that we are Greece to their Rome and that they don't know very much. They have, of the top 20 universities in the world, I think probably about 15 of them are in the United States. So I've had just as good a feedback and a thoughtful feedback there as anywhere else.
Thank you. I have one question before we open it up to the floor, And I would encourage our listeners to use the chat function to pose their questions, because I'm sure they'll become fast and furious. But what effects do you think the mega trends such as climate change, population growth, intensifying competition for resources, and the ubiquity of modern communications technologies had on weakening or indeed strengthening the explanatory power of geography?
All those things are actually connected to each other and can also be taken in isolation, and they have all affected geography. But none of them have made it more important or less important. To be taken one by one, climate change. Obviously, that's geographic. And the best example is probably Bangladesh, if it's true that the modelling says the bottom third will become increasingly salinated, in which case nothing can grow, in which case the population movement, which was your second one, will increase. But that's entirely a geographic factor that you need to understand if you understand the modern world. Resources, it's the same thing. I'm writing a new book at the moment and making the point that in the 19th century, luck or otherwise of geography, you had coal where you were, and Britain and Europe had coal, and it certainly helped them get around the world. And it's also interesting that where the coal was found, some of the stronger nations, France, Germany, Britain, and America, had coal on their land and did not need to go out and search for it and conquer peoples to get it. When you flip it to the 20th century and the switch from coal to oil, by Churchill, just prior to the First World War, that flips the history of the 20th century, but it's geographic, because now you need to go after where the oil is. The Middle East becomes central to all geopolitical thinking. And then if we move forward into the late part of this century, we will find that other areas are becoming more important. Well, they already are in some respects. The Democratic Republic of Congo is busy having one of the world's worst wars, and has been for 2 or 3 decades now. And it's partly fueled by the fact that the stuff that's in our mobile phones, well, it comes out of the DRC, which helps to prolong those wars. So absolutely resources, but you see, all the examples you've given and all the examples I've given for them, all of them dovetail exactly with geography. It hasn't changed the importance of geography. It's just at times changed the focus of where we look at geography. The last one, the communications, that is different, but ties in as well. Again, I make the point in Divided, I think it is, that the communication explosion is one of the factors that has driven the massive population movements, because for the first time in the history of the world, pretty much everybody can see just how everybody else lives. And naturally, a lot of people think, I want some of that, and you can't blame them. So the comms has allowed them to see that and to want that. And then the communications has allowed them, along with other factors, to actually make contact with people along a route, follow that route and go to places. And that in turn has driven part of our politics. I think it had an effect on Brexit, for example. It's had an effect on the election of Mr. Trump. So all these things are interconnected. All of them are connected to geography, and none of them either diminish or accentuate the importance of geography. They are just new ways and new places to look at it.
Thank you. I think that our audience are now really anxious to be able to, keen on being able to pose their own questions to you, because I've been thrown up with many chats, and we're just going to take them in the order in which they appear. So we'll take the first question, please.
Which would be Patrick Horton. Patrick, can you unmute?
Yes, sorry. I thought it would be read from the screen. My question is, Tim, and I did really enjoy your book, Prisoners of Geography. Now, my question is, how much has the use of drones capable of being flown thousands of miles away, has changed the nature of warfare and the influence of geography?
They have changed the nature of warfare. There's no question about that, Patrick, which obviously I think you know from your question. I don't think it's changed the influence of geography. It's just changed the distance. I mean, it's a bit like cruise missiles. Once upon a time, if you stood a certain distance from someone, they couldn't harm you. And then when we learned to throw spears, that distance got shorter, and then bullets, it got shorter still. And nowadays, you can throw a cruise missile at somebody. But you would still factor in geography and all those things, including cruise missiles, because my scientists need to tell me, with my general's hat on, how far it's going to go and what it's going to do when it gets there. Now we come up to the drone warfare. It's changed the nature of warfare in many ways. Certainly targeted assassinations are far easier and can reach remote places which a cruise missile might not be able to find, because you can hover above watch and find for 2 or 3 days. And when you found them, another one can come along and kill that person. So it's changed warfare in that manner. We are now seeing already, again, in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, it looks like Turkey has supplied swarms of drones to the Azerbaijanis. And these swarms of drones are hitting Armenian tanks and fixed positions without much risk. A, they're very small and they're hard to hit, and they can be flown quite high. And B, there's no pilots in them. So, okay, you take the financial risk. But, I mean, I don't know the actual costs, but I suspect you could probably buy 100 drones for one F-16. And if that F-16 goes down, you've lost, X tens of millions of dollars, plus 1 or 2 pilots. If you lose 3 or 4 drones, you haven't lost as much money and you haven't lost any pilots. So it's changed warfare in that manner. And of course, it's changing warfare in what you have to do to combat against them. And then coming down the line are mini drones, the size of flies, which you won't be able to see, and they will be able to fire a poison dart at you. So we've actually gone back about 3,000 years, but they'll be able to fire a poison dart at you, and you won't even know it. So all this new technology is sweeping around. But I always go back to that point. Forgive me, it's a bit like a broken record. But if you can come up with these examples, I will come up with why geography is still important. Even the tiny little space that the drone fly can get into. It's geography. Is that on the lines of what you were thinking?
I think that answers the question very nicely. Can we please have the next question from the audience?
Okay, from Peter Martin. With the rapid decline of oil, what is your prognosis for the economic and strategic future of the Middle East?
Someone who's read that better than I have is the Saudi Crown Prince, who, for all his faults, Khashoggi, for example, and many other things, has seen the future and is planning for it. Saudi 2030, you may be aware of, their strategy that came out about 2 years ago. He aims to wean Saudi Arabia off oil. I think it's a bit ambitious to do it in 10 years, and he's diversifying. Unlike Russia, he's diversifying quite rapidly. They're putting huge sums of money into solar, which of course they have a lot of, trying to wean themselves off, trying to get ordinary Saudis into the workplace. Because, I remember being in Jeddah a few years ago and I went down to the docks, and everybody that was a fisherman, that was mending the nets, that was you name it, they were Bangladeshis. They need to get Saudis to learn how to fish again and drive taxis and clean hotel rooms. And they're slowly doing it. Because the Crown Prince knows that they're going to become much less relevant as the decades pass. Now, I think it'll be slower. Is it Brookings? Not Brookings, Bloomberg Bloomberg believes that by 2050, 50% of the world's energy will be from renewables. That's what, 30 years away. So the money for them is going to go down. The UAE is taking the same decisions. So the Middle East will inevitably become less important, but it's going to take decades, especially when it comes to gas. We will wean ourselves off oil first, and then we will wean ourselves off gas, which gives Russia a bit longer because they've got massive gas supplies. So, you know, it is a revolution, and in 200 years' time, we'll look back at it, at the oil age ended. But when you're living through it, you know, it takes decades. From a historical perspective, oh yes, you know, those few years. So the Middle East will become less important, at which point, I mean, there's 100 different examples to give you, which we don't have time for, obviously. But what would then happen, let's say in 15 years, America is now more or less self-sufficient in energy anyway. Everybody's going into renewables. There's going to be winners and losers. Let's say Saudi has diversified. The problem for Saudi then is, why is America going to defend Saudi Arabia's solar panels? It's not. So if America's not going to defend Saudi Arabia's solar panels the way it defends Saudi Arabia's oil, that was the big deal forged in 1945 between Ibn Saud and FDR. You're going to give us lots of oil for fairly cheap, and we're going to protect you from everybody. Well, that breaks down, doesn't it, when they haven't got any oil? So A, people are diversifying, they become less important, and B, there are ramifications for that. That's one, and we don't have time, but I could probably give you one for, you know, just about every country in the world. Algeria, they better get moving on diversifying. Russia doesn't seem to be doing very much. There will be other winners and losers, and don't write off oil and gas for a long time. And the last bit, again, because we don't have time, but the big broad brush bit, is that the geopolitics of where you get the stuff to build your renewable energy from becomes more and more important. Australia is sitting pretty. Australia has it's called the lucky country. It had coal, doesn't have any oil, but what it has got is an awful lot of stuff that we need for renewables. If you make 100-foot long blade that spins round and round to create electricity, I think the batteries from it, the stuff you need for those, come from Chile. They're sitting pretty. A lot of it comes from Australia. They're sitting pretty. Germany is investing massively in the technology that the countries that do have wind and solar power. So although they haven't got so much of it themselves, they're making the technology. So all these things are coming into play. And again, they don't happen overnight. They happen over decades, but we are a good 10 years into it. And the experts say, middle of this century, 30 years, it's flipped. And when it flips economically, it'll be much more viable, and then you'll see a much faster acceleration. We won't be here to see it, but by the end of the century, oil and gas are probably dead.
Thank you. Can we please have the next question?
Jude.
Hello. Are you suggesting that geography is as much a sense experience as an intellectual one? And do you think the internet has flattened our sense of the world in a way, exacerbated by what seems to be our retreat from actually getting out into nature and experiencing it firsthand?
Geography is an intellectual sense, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I've never actually thought of it in those terms because it is physical, but it is intellectual, yes, because of how it impacts on our hinterland and how we think and frame and understand. Your second part about flattening, I don't sense that. I think people get out and about as much as they did. I don't think people are retreating. I could be wrong, but you know, the younger people are still going out in their gap yards, and people are still exploring. People still love to travel. So no, I don't agree with the second part of your premise, but the first, absolutely, it is an intellectual experience, and thank you for introducing that thought to me.
Thank you.
Next question, please.
Betty Suchar.
Well, I was just wondering about the ambitious projects that China had and whether or not you think they've been adversely affected by the COVID crisis.
They have had a very quick recovery that surprised a lot of economists. Their bigger problem is us. I mean, the deal is they make the stuff and we buy it. If we don't buy it, they're in trouble. And, you know, our imports are going down. They actually recovered more quickly because they can do things that a democracy can't. Mandatory testing, mandatory mask wearing, you know, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed. They literally boarded people up in their flats and stationed police officers outside. I'm not making an argument for it, but it is what a dictatorship can do to suppress. And they then unlocked quite quickly, and they have actually got back quite quickly. They have a longer term problem in that if we don't sort it in the bigger consumer societies, we're not going to buy their stuff. We don't buy their stuff. They don't make it. They don't make it. Their factories close. Their factories close. They have a lot of unemployed people. They do things at scale in China, and the demonstrations and discord that there would be. So it's in their interest for us to get back on our feet as well. No, that they are up and running again so quickly. They've taken a hit, but they're up and running. I mean, they have other big structural problems, but they have surprised a lot of people. They've got over that hurdle much more quickly than we have. You can't rule out a massive second wave there. I was looking at some statistics this morning. There is a city, I forget which one, I've not even heard of it. They have so many cities that are bigger than London that we've never heard of. And it's over 9 million people. They're going to mandatory test all 9 million. And they'll probably do it in the next half hour, you know, given their dictatorial efficiency.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
We've got two other questions, and I hope Patrick won't mind if I ask Penny Rhodes to give hers first. Patrick has got a supplementary question, a second question. But Penny, your question first, please.
Sorry, I'm just working out how to unmute here.
You're okay, Penny, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Just given this development of communications, or more accessible communications around the world, in developing countries, etc., this homogenous global youth culture has been created. It's very difficult to tell a teenager from Germany from a UK teenager, and that's now spreading obviously worldwide. Do you think this will give rise to the death of these individual populations that have specific cultures that have developed as a result of their perhaps remoteness or their specific geography?
I think it slightly flattens it. I'd agree with that, but Sparta fought Athens. They were pretty similar. Greece fought Rome. They were pretty similar, etc. I hope that's not too much of a cliche, but okay, to bring it up to date, another cliche. If you watch Germany play football against Netherlands and there is a crowd there, they may be wearing the same clothes, but they're very, very different in their opinions of each other. When you look at the Italian statistics on their views of the European Union and Brussels at the moment, they're way out of kilter. And that includes the youth with Brussels. And that's actually to do with COVID, but it's to do with more than COVID. If you look at the youth of Pakistan, I don't think they have that much in common. And the examples go on around the world. I reluctantly disagree with the premise, because I know exactly what you mean, and there is this idea that we have a world culture, and there is some truth to that. a lot of it has come out of the United States. But there will be a backlash. There is already a backlash against it. There will be in the future more of a backlash against it. I don't see the crowds out in the streets in Sudan clamoring to have a culture like they have in the United States. And it's a sad fact of our history, the amount of conflict we have had with the other. And I think even if you can develop a global youth culture where people like rap, I don't think it'll stop that otherness. You look at some of the rappers in the Arab world, some of the rappers in Pakistan, some of the British Asian rappers, and you see the anti-Semitism that comes out in their raps. That's not a global culture accepting the other. That's just using a culture to perpetuate the existing divisions. So I reluctantly think that we will carry on as before. Whilst we're on our steep learning curve, Penny, we're still learning as far as I can tell. We're still getting better at this, not worse, but I don't think a youth culture is going to massively change the game. Do you agree?
Well, having a lot of teenagers and having travelled the world, I think I would like you to answer that question perhaps in 10 years' time.
Yeah, I hope you're right. I hope you're right.
Okay, thank you.
We've got Patrick's second question and then Jane, please.
Yes, if I can slightly rephrase my question but keep the meaning. Now, this is in reference to India and Pakistan, and then both being nuclear powers. Would you agree that geography makes this most unlikely because of the proximity of their major cities to each other?
Yes, and it's not just their geography. It is the same as why the Russians and the Americans never threw nuclear missiles at each other. They know that's the end of them. I mean, there's the whole debate about Iran, whether the Ayatollahs would like to usher in the age of the Mahdi returning, the hidden Imam returning to usher in a glorious rule of Allah. So nuclear war doesn't really matter, does it? I mean, what, 60 million Iranians to achieve that? I doubt they are as religiously crazy as that. To come back to India, Pakistan. Yes, you're absolutely right. They are, you know, they border each other. The two capital cities are a matter of, well, you probably know better than I, 200 or 300 miles from each other. Against that, and I don't buy it, against that, there have been several surveys in India that suggest that the majority of Indian people view nuclear bombs as big bombs. You know, they just see them as really, really big bombs. And that's partly because, despite being a first world nation in many ways, you know, there is X hundred millions of Indians who are illiterate and not very well educated. But so I don't think that even Modi, this Hindu nationalist that's in charge of India at the moment, you know, he's not one of those people. Even if he is a religious nationalist, you know, he and the high command, they know the history. They know what happened at Hiroshima. They know what would happen to them if they struck Pakistan, both depending on which way the wind was blowing and also the response that Pakistan would have. So, yeah, I agree with you. It is always a danger, as it was with the Americans and Russians who, you know, they did approach that threshold a couple of times, and it is always a danger. And there is always this crazy, crazy element of pride. I think people underestimate it, just how stupid people will be, including leaders, when it comes to pride. But push comes to shove, it's pretty unlikely, just as it's pretty unlikely that North Korea, even if they develop the long-range missiles to get to America, will be stupid enough to do it, because that's the end of them. You have to work against it. You have to work to reduce nukes and to reduce the tensions, because it's always possible, but it is not the most likely scenario.
Jane.
Hello, no, it's John. I'm actually using my wife's laptop. Tim, Thanks for your talk.
Thank you.
Your book has covered most of the world, but not Indonesia, the Philippines, and adjacent smaller states.
Mm.
Do you think this area is going to become any more important globally in the medium term?
Well, I suspect from your question, you know more about it than I do, really, because you probably have a sneaking suspicion that it is.
I've no idea.
Okay.
Just a lot of people.
We all know that in that region is the Strait of Malacca, and with or without oil going through it, and it does, then it's one of the great choke points of the world, and that's why it's one of the important points of the world. And I'm sure, mention it, although you're right, I didn't focus on it. I don't think it's going to become more important. I think it retains its strategic importance, primarily because of the Strait of Malacca, but also because it's part of the wall in front of China, the way that China looks at the world. You know, they look outwards and they see in front of them Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Indonesia, and it's this, they call it the 9-line dash, this wall in front of them that prevents them from getting out into the great sea lanes of the Pacific. So it will remain absolutely as important as it was. I'm in the new book I'm writing for next year. There's a chapter on Australia, and the area above them does get several pages attention, because that is a geographic battleground for influence. Both the Americans and the Australians do not want those countries to become closer to China. And that's related to a wider issue. You may be aware of the Quad. I wrote about it 5 years ago. It is getting more important. The Quad is India, Australia, Japan, America. And they're a very unlikely partnership, but they've formed this naval partnership to push back against the Chinese pushing out. And now there's something called Quad Plus. The South Koreans want to join it, one or two others. And this is to do with the region that you've mentioned. It's to shore up the alliances that seek to say, together, we are able to handle China. If we try to do it individually, they will overrun us. Not necessarily militarily, but they will overrun us economically and dominate us with their influence. And so the Quad and the Quad Plus is becoming more important. And within that lies Philippines and Indonesia. I mean, you're right. I mean, Indonesia, what is it? Hundreds, 800 million people, something massive like that. But I'm just looking at my little map of the world. Yeah, I don't see them becoming geographically any more important than they are. They are geographically important, primarily because of the Malacca Straits, also now because of this zone of influence that both China and the Quad have to influence. It's a fascinating region about which I know not very much.
Thank you.
Peter, you've got another question.
Okay. I think I have to unmute myself. I've done. Coal powered the West. Hydrogen is the new coal. Once everybody has access to unlimited power via hydrogen, there must be less incentive for international disputes. For example, China has suddenly stopped buying Australian coal. There's a dispute over the Russia-German pipeline and so on.
China reduced coal, but also it reduced its wheat imports, which really hit Australia. And that's because Australia had the temerity to criticize it about the Uyghurs last year, and also said something nice about the Dalai Lama. And whenever you do that, they get you. I don't think hydrogen is the new coal. I think it has the potential to be, but I don't think it is yet. And that's to do with economics. It's like shale gas, for example. It was always there. It was never economically viable to get it out of the ground because it's cheaper to get black oil, or shale oil, out of the ground. Only when it became economically viable at prices quite high about 8 years ago did they bother to go and get it. And it's expensive to produce. I know water is free, but it's expensive to produce hydropower. You're probably aware of the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. It's just opened this year. It takes the water from the Blue Nile, and it's going to power every single house in Ethiopia for free. That is a game changer. That is a model for the rest of the century. But it's not going to reduce conflict necessarily, because Egypt is extremely worried that it's going to lose 20% of its farmland because it lives on the Nile. So there's one positive and negative. Another one is India-Pakistan control of the headwaters, because they both rely on the same headwaters. If they cooperate, great. If they don't, then hydropower becomes a source of conflict. In the big picture, looking ahead, I actually think your point is valid and hopefully will come true. Because the more we have renewables, wind, water, and solar panels, which of course are everywhere. Scotland's in a very good position for wind power, solar not so much. This is a global thing that we can all access. It can reduce, obviously, fossil fuel contamination of the planet. Absolutely, it can reduce conflict if you get it right. I mean, Ethiopia has to agree to share enough of the water with both Sudan and then Egypt. And also, this is what the experts say, I don't know this next bit, but apparently the electricity that you will then generate from it, you will put into ever larger grids, so that, the whole of Europe could be one grid, and one country draws from it when it needs it more, and another country draws from it. And you could replicate this across other parts of the world. So if you're sharing an electric grid, just as, let's say, the French and the Germans shared the coal that became the genesis of the European Union, if you can create these electric grids from renewables over many countries, they're hardly going to bomb each other and destroy the grids. So I am actually quite optimistic that when we tip into renewables being the majority, and then the costs come down and it accelerates, I think there is a big potential for reducing the competition for resources between us. And it is the competition for resources between us that has always driven our conflicts. So it would follow we could reduce conflict.
Thank you, Tim. Are there any other questions that people have got? Because I've got one.
Oh dear.
When I did A-level geography, Tim, I found that I was... can I go on with mine, Jolien, and then I'll come to you later. And I got really interested in China. It wasn't on our syllabus, but I ended up answering questions on it, which probably accounts for my A-level result. Did you, when you were writing your many books on the state of the world, did you come up across a place that really, really fascinated you above the others?
Israel. Its geographic beauty, skiing in the morning, sunbathing by the beach in the afternoon, floating in the Dead Sea in the evening, because it's so small. And then, of course, the history and the geography of it. The great three monotheistic religions coming together under one roof. Well, not so much coming together, but existing together under one roof. And then the current political situation, which is endlessly fascinating, if a little bit nerdy for many people. So, yeah, I would say Israel. And then, well, the Middle East in general really captured my imagination, and so did the Balkans. I think, yeah, I would say the Balkans and the Middle East are the two places that I kept going back to and back to and back to, partially because of events, but also by choice. And I could have tried to persuade the bosses that, I really needed to be X, Y, and Z, more in India or more in Pakistan or places. But no, it was those two regions that always just captivated me.
Not what one would have predicted, I would say.
By the way, I must salute your A-level decisions, because one of the things I learned in television was when some presenter asked you a question which either told you, the viewer, every single thing you were about to say, because they do that. They ask you these 90-second long questions, some of them, 90-second long questions, with all the facts and figures about the story, and then pretty much ask you to agree with them. And I always wanted just to say, yes, and then just shut, but you get into trouble. Sorry, but the response to that and to a question which is like, what is what you did in your A-levels? The response is, well, that's a very good question, but what people here are talking about is, and then just talk about whatever you want, which is what you did in your A-levels.
The Boris Johnson answer to geography questions.
I mean, yes. Sorry,
right, so, the Laycock family, I think, had a question.
Okay. Can I come in there?
Yeah.
Speak. I'd just like to. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can all hear you.
Okay. I just wanted to make a quick question, really, Tim. When you look at the modern world, do you see the shock of European culture and the dominance of the English language as significant factors in global instability?
Instabilities.
Instability, yes.
Yes, but also stability. The instabilities are, the easier ones. I mean, we all look at the lines drawn in Africa and elsewhere, and they absolutely contribute to the current lines that the British drew, and others. I mean, the Sahel, for example, the French drew a lot of those lines, like the one in Mali. And yeah, the current conflict in the Sahel, with the 6,000 French troops are fighting there now, there is a direct line back to colonialism, and of course the places that the British, drew their lines. So I agree with that. Conversely, the English-speaking countries are amongst the most stable in the world: Canada, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand. And their form of politics, I think, is the best compared to all the others, as the Churchill quote has. But the legacy of colonialism, yes, is still with us, and absolutely contributes to some of the instability in the world. But countries have managed to take the British Constitution such as it is, or the British legal concepts and political concepts, and have tried to put them onto their own states with their own versions of them. And I think that basically I believe in liberal democracy. I think it is the best form of government if applied properly at the right time in the right place. That's not always been the case so far, but I hope it will be eventually, because I think liberal democracy does lead to stability, because liberal democracy is at its heart about fairness and sharing. Colonialism isn't about that, but liberal democracy is, and you can't separate the two.
Thank you. I think we've now almost got to the end of our time together, unfortunately, and we're going to soon have to wrap up. But before we go, Tim, I'd really like to ask you a little bit about your more recent book, Divided, While We're Living in an Age of Walls. And I'd really appreciate it if you could just give us a little taster of that book.
Thank you. Well, I feel I've depressed you enough already. I came across this stat when I was looking for a new book to write, and I came across this stat that 35% of countries in the world wall or fence themselves off from their neighbours, which is a third of all the countries. That's about 60 countries in the world. And I thought, well, hang on, I thought we were living in this flat world. I thought we were living in this globalized, interdependent, flat world. There was this book by American intellectual called The World is Flat. I said his name, you'd recall it. It's a New York Times columnist, Thomas Friedman. And I thought, no, the world isn't flat. I'm afraid it's not. It really isn't. And so these 60 countries divide or fence themselves off. So I started to write about why they divide or fence or wall themselves off from each other. And then I widened it out into the other divisions, which have gone into the identification divisions that we now have through social media. So, there's a chapter about Trump's wall. There's a chapter about India, which has completely fenced off Bangladesh. The whole 3,000 kilometers of it is fenced. And people don't know about that because they concentrate so much on Trump's wall. Kenya has fenced off Somalia. Zambia has fenced off Zimbabwe, etc., etc. So it's about that, with chapters on the big walls and fences. But then there's also chapters on the divisions which have accelerated through social media. And in the chapter on China, for example, it's how they are using the internet to simultaneously divide the Chinese people from each other to keep them united. I mean, I know that's an oxymoron, if you like, but they make sure they can't talk to each other in the ways that we can talk to each other, precisely to stop them from organizing in each individual place, like the Uyghurs or the Tibetans, etc. So it's about these divisions. I'm writing another book, actually, for next year called The Power of Geography, which is going into places like Australia and Ethiopia, Iran, places that I didn't go into in the first book. And I'm afraid that also, has some negative aspects to it. But I'm not a pessimist, you'd be amazed to hear. One of the influential books I read in the past 5 years was Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, in which he argues we have to hold on to the Enlightenment values, which have been so denigrated by the generation below mine, ours, I should say. Our liberal democracies are being trashed, and mainstream media is held in disregard, sometimes rightly. But Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now shows us how, over the past 400 years, using Enlightenment values for all the problems of colonialism, etc., and the wars, Hiroshima, you name it, we have been going like that, with occasional dips. Auschwitz, perhaps you could mark as a dip. Well, obviously you can, dips. But we've been going like that, and we are continuing to go like that. And the technologies, we mentioned hydrogen, artificial intelligence, etc., I really believe that we will continue to go like that. Longevity will continue to grow. Death in childbirth will continue to drop. The diseases around the world, COVID notwithstanding, will continue to be eradicated. So despite everything I've said for the past hour, just disregard all that, because it's going to be fine.
I just want to thank you very much for giving us so generously of your time, for being very receptive to the diverse questions that our audience have asked, and for giving us such a cracking good read on which to base our questions and our intellectual interests and curiosity, and for giving us further books to look forward to in the future. So thank you to all our listeners and participants, and particularly a huge thank you, Tim, for joining us this morning. It's been a thorough eye-opener and has set off running 1,000 intellectual errors.
None of which I can catch. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask Penny to stay on the line, please? Thanks, but thank you, everyone. Went well.
Please. Yeah.
If everyone else wants to end, that would be great. Do you want to end now, Valerie and Penny? Penny, Valerie, you're muted.
I just want to thank you very much indeed for a fascinating lecture and questions. Most interesting. Thank you and excellent chairing. Bye-bye.
Bye.